Welcome to Democracy Dialogues, a conversation we need to be having now about the state of democracy in the Americas. I'm Eric Farnsworth, your series host. Central America is gripped by political and economic crisis. Guatemalans have just voted in the first round of presidential elections, several leading candidates having been disqualified in advance. Corruption remains a concern. El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, is bending state institutions to suit his personal interests while being accused of trampling human rights in a quest for enhanced security. Honduras remains desperately poor, a country seeking quick answers from China, even as the social fabric deteriorates. Nicaragua has sunk into dystopian dictatorship. For all, authoritarian impulses are apparent. Meanwhile, migration flows and drug trafficking both continue unabated. It wasn't supposed to be like this. After the brutal civil conflicts ended in 1996, the advent of at least a veneer of democratic governance and enhanced market access to the United States through freer trade, Central America was set for takeoff. Or so it was said at the time. What happened, and where do we go from here? Eric Olson is with the Seattle International Foundation. For years, he has been a strong, deeply knowledgeable, and respected voice of reason on Central American development and democracy issues. So Caio, thank you for joining us here at Democracy Dialogues.
Great to be with you, Eric.
Before we get to the Guatemalan elections, let's build in some context.
Yeah.
Is Central America better off today than at the beginning of this century?
Well, those are always complicated questions. I guess I would say yes, insofar as you pointed out in your intro, armed conflict, ended during the 1980s, different points. And so as we entered into the new century, millennium, there was some reason for hope in Central America. Salvador was peaceful, first time in decades. Guatemala had ended its armed conflict. There were some frameworks for future democracy in the region. And I think there was a sense of optimism. And in fact, I think there was maybe a little too much optimism. The international community that had been very engaged in Central America decided, okay, armed conflict's over, we don't need to be there anymore, let them figure it out. All understandable. But it created a situation in which voices that were more and more extreme began to take hold. First, very slowly. It's difficult to know when it started. But what has resulted now are very, very weak democracies, if you can even call them that. I would say that we're living in an authoritarian moment in Central America, varying degrees. You're correct to say that Nicaragua is probably the most extreme.
Yeah.
But each country in Central America now is on the pathway towards authoritarian government.
The Cold War was over, peace was at hand, freer trade with the United States, the region was poised for takeoff, but what did we miss? What was the element that got in there and corroded all of that optimism that you were talking about?
Well, in hindsight now it's easy,
Sure.
so I want to be sure and point that out.
Yeah.
But I think two things happen. One is an over-reliance on elections. Elections are necessary, are important. Free and fair elections are always part of this process, which we saw now in Guatemala. But democracy has to go beyond elections. It has to be institutional. There has to be independent institutions, attorney general, courts, other institutions. And we didn't really, and I'd say the region didn't really invest as much in those areas. And that is then the entrance of the second factor, which I think you were hinting at, growing corruption. You don't have rule of law that's strong, that's independent, that's able to hold people accountable today. And that eroded over the last two decades. And that opens the space for more, again, authoritarian forms of government, centralized control, lack of accountability. And I think those issues permeate societies there, not just in terms of sort of white-collar crime, but really affect the education system. When you have large percentage of teachers that don't show up or getting paid, or they're called the ghost employees. It creates an environment in which external investors, international investors, have less confidence. What's going to happen? I have a good friend that works for one of the big box stores, and he's told me repeatedly, we have a lot of money we would like to invest in Central America, but we can't because corruption, rule of law, all the basic things that they need to guarantee have been eroded through corruption. So it permeates healthcare, education, the economy, and it really creates a negative drag on those countries.
Is there something in addition to that? And this isn't a leading question, it's a genuine question, because we talk about corruption a lot, but frankly, there's corruption in all societies. And what is it about Central America, perhaps, where corruption itself has really gotten into the democratic institutions to the point that it is, we're talking about, is the region even democratic anymore?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I've thought a lot about this. Yeah. Yes, there's corruption in the United States, let's be honest. There's corruption in Sweden and Norway, or wherever they rank, the top of the list.
Yes.
There is corruption. The question is not, does it exist or doesn't it, but do you have the institutions, do you have the capacity, the guardrails to hold it back, to fight it, to hold people accountable? And that's what's been eroded, and that's what I say we're really in an authoritarian moment in Central America. Listen, what are some of the elements of authoritarianism? Extreme concentration of power, repression, and the inability to hold people accountable. And what's happened in Nicaragua, what's happened in El Salvador, what's happened in Guatemala, and to a great extent, increasingly in Honduras, is that those independent institutions, the Attorney General, the tribunals, the courts, independent journalists, other independent mechanisms have been attacked, have been eroded, have been thrown out of the country, have been incarcerated. And so the guardrails there, the mechanisms to fight corruption, are weakened and even non-existent. And that's when corruption becomes systemic throughout a society. Again, it's not just one guy stuffing his pocket with money. It's systemic. It affects the education system, the healthcare system. The amount of money that was stolen during the pandemic in Central America is stunning. And that robs the Central American people of their future. And then we get into the issue of migration. You have no future where you are. You don't believe in a future in your country. What alternative do you have? You head north, or in some cases in Nicaragua, they head south.
Is that primarily a courts, judicial system issue, or is there also something perhaps in the civic consciousness about, I don't know, the way of doing business? Or, I mean, we're getting into some things that probably are improvable. It's speculation and it's, discussion of, attitudes. But you do wonder, because you hear this discussion a lot, well, it's corruption, okay. But how do you get at it? How do you attack it? It has to be more than just bringing cases before the local courts.
Right, and in some cases, again, Nicaragua, El Salvador, in all four cases, one of the first things the governments do is erode the capacity of the judiciary to act independently, right? We have over 30 judges and prosecutors here in Washington, D.C. from Guatemala.
Over 30.
Who are fighting corruption in Guatemala and now have been forced out into exile in various ways. Some folks are in prison. So attacking that institution is a first step. And then, as you say, there is a growing sense of expectation that the system is corrupt. And that can lead to two things. It can lead to sort of, just acceptance, apathy. Why vote? Why get engaged? Why do anything if there's corruption? Another motivation for migration. Other option, and this is what surprised us in Guatemala, is that people do get disgusted and do look for alternatives. And I think that's the connection back to what just happened in Guatemala. Stunning results that a little known, totally underfunded candidate who was polling in 8th place suddenly appeared as the second finisher and on to a runoff. with real possibilities of winning. And his message was one of fighting corruption and reestablishing the rule of law in their country.
Let's talk about the Guatemalan elections. It was a surprising result to almost every observer. To what do you attribute that? I mean, certainly it wasn't just his message, because that should have been resonating on the campaign, no?
Yeah, but I think you're right. I mean, I confess I had no expectation that this gentleman, Bernardo Arévalo, would actually emerge as a candidate. Good guy, well educated, a lot of international experience. I would call him sort of a centrist social democrat type. His father was a president of Guatemala,
yes.
really important. A lot of good things about him, but nobody had much of an expectation. If anything, it would be sort of a symbolic vote to support him. And I think it goes to the issue that we were just talking about, the perception that things can't change. The system is corrupt, so you sort of give into it, right? And even a lot of in the exile community had decided, what we're going to have to do is vote for the less bad candidate, right? Not for the one we want, but the less bad. And obviously, people in Guatemala, not from any political stripe, thought differently. Now, there is a possibility that what really helped Arévalo get over the line into the second round is that he appealed to young people. And, one analysis in Guatemala City showed that a lot of votes for him came from upper middle class and upper class areas. One would think, maybe it'll be poor people disgusted by crime. There are a lot of young people in that country who are also disgusted by the oligarchs and the old guard playing such dirty political tools. So I think that ultimately enough people decided to not accept the status quo, to vote against the status quo, that it surprised all of us. And I think it's a great lesson for everyone, not just Guatemalans, for others in Central America and in the United States, that we just can't give in to these authoritarian tendencies and vote for a better future.
There will be a second round. Arévalo is going against Sandra Torres, who is who received the most number of votes. Without asking you for your prediction on the results there, but what would you be looking for between now and the second round in terms of guaranteeing that the vote would be free and fair?
Well, ironically and interestingly enough, the process of voting in Guatemala is pretty fair. One of the civil society monitoring groups, I think, identified about 47 incidents of problem. Nothing systemic. 47 is really a small number in a country the size of Guatemala. So the problem really isn't at the day of voting kinds of things. The problem is the system itself, and in particular what annoyed or angered people was that the electoral tribunal in charge of overseeing the election disqualified a lot of candidates ahead of time.
Let's talk about that. What were some of the reasons there? Were they legitimate, justified?
I mean, in my opinion, not so much. They were all on technicalities. Some probably more important than others, but
But is it, and this is, again, I mean, it's a question that I've heard raised with me. I mean, technicalities are rule of law. And so if we're complaining about rule of law, if somebody doesn't follow the letter of it, can we then be upset that they're disqualified? Maybe there's a bigger question out there, but is that a legitimate way to look at these things?
I think it's a legitimate question. I don't have any doubt about it. The problem is this. One, some of the technicalities had to do about things that happened 9 months ago, even a year ago, that should have been reported and investigated and taken care of at the moment. Instead, they deal with it now prior to the elections. And that really raises questions about the objectivity and the motivation. The second thing is they disqualify some candidates on grounds, and they rule in some candidates on the same grounds.
And that's, I think, the key point, right? There's a consistency issue here that then begins to have a political component, or at least the appearance, no?
Exactly. And you know, this is an old tool of autocrats. Daniel Ortega used it extremely effectively. Technically speaking, he was right to disqualify different candidates. But we all know it was silly technicalities. You used a black ink pen instead of a blue ink pen on a pink slip instead of a blue slip. I mean, come on. At the end of the day, there's a bigger principle here. I'm not suggesting ignoring the law. That's clear. But enforcing the law has to be timely, has to be transparent, can't be, you know, literally a month or two before an election to disqualify a major candidate on some technicality. I think that's the issue, really.
We're here with Eric Olson of the Seattle International Foundation discussing democracy in Central America and the recent elections in Guatemala, among other places. Let's continue with Guatemala for just a minute, Eric. Will there be a mandate from whoever's elected to address some of these issues that we've been talking about? Corruption, rule of law. And the reason why I'm asking is because, as you have alluded to yourself, even in our conversation already today, the investor community is looking at these issues very seriously. And there's money that is available for investment that folks are saying, well, until the investment climate in the region is better, maybe I'll hold on to it for a little bit longer, or maybe I'll put it somewhere else. Do you see a mandate arising out of this election to address some of these issues?
Well, I think the honest answer is that Guatemala, like so many other countries, is highly polarized. So I don't know that we can expect either of the main candidates to run away with the election. I suspect at best they'll get 52, 53%, either of them. I think if Arévalo wins with this clear message of combating corruption and reestablishing the rule of law, then there is a bit of a mandate there, not because of the percentage, but because it's unexpected and because the message is resonating not just with a political party, but extensively with the citizenry around Guatemala. The Semilla movement is tiny, has no resources.
That's his political party.
That's his political party, I'm sorry. And so for them to reach the threshold, 50% plus one, is just astonishing. And it means that they've had an appeal broadly in the country. And so you could argue that that's a bit of a mandate, even though it's not, 60 or 70%. Now, I'm not a businessman, I'm not an investor, but I think if I were in those shoes and Arévalo won, I would say, okay, it's time to think and consider Guatemala as a possible investment, but probably wait a year to see how it is. Because I think one of his big challenges, and again, I'm not taking sides here, but one of the challenges he would face is that he doesn't have a majority in the Congress. That's already clear. And there will be strong resistance by the old guard and the corrupt class to any major reforms he makes. And the other point, and this is getting into the weeds, but the current Attorney General, who the United States has designated as undemocratic and withdrawn her visa and so on and so forth, her term doesn't end for another 3 years. So whoever takes office in January of next year has to deal with the same corrupt Attorney General and her prosecutors for another 2.5 to 3 years. So I think could be cause for optimism, what I would call a glimmer of hope in Guatemala. But I also think that it will take a little bit of time to see how it works itself out.
Well, and I think that's the key. We don't know who's going to be elected. And whoever it is is going to have to deal with these same issues. And we'll be looking at the same issues, presumably, through a similar lens. And what's interesting to me is that you don't have the outsider candidate elected or making it to the second round, right? And oftentimes if you have, the popular complete rejection of, a system or the corruption or what have you, you can get an outsider candidate, a populist candidate, somebody who comes into them and blow up the system, which is what we're facing perhaps in Ecuador or other places that see elections coming up. But It's an interesting phenomenon, no?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that Arévalo is an outsider.
Okay.
His father was a president, but I think, that was in the 1940s.
Yeah.
So he's an intellectual, internationally educated, but he's kind of an outsider, and that's what's surprising and shocking.
An outsider from his potential economic perspective as a populist? You're not suggesting that? Or
No, you're right. On that front, no. I think Sandra Torres could be much more categorized as a populist, even a leftist populist, although I don't know what that means anymore. But you're right, he's not a populist in that sense, in a leftist Hugo Chavez kind of way.
Yeah.
I think that's a complete misread. But he's an outsider in that he's not part of the establishment. Mm-hmm. He's not part of the economic or political establishment that's been running the country since the end of the Civil War in 1996.
In 96. We've been talking a lot about Guatemala, but Central America obviously has a lot of other countries as well. Let's look at El Salvador for just a bit. The president there has been cleaning up the streets, as he says, and many people have given him credit for that. Indeed, crime does seem to be down, perhaps corruption, but it comes at a cost. And I wonder, how do you find a balance in a democratic society between personal security, which the people demand, but also civil liberties, which the people also demand? It's a tough balancing act, no?
It is a tough balancing act, although I think sometimes people overstate the dilemma, right? I think it's very possible to have security in a democratic society. In fact, that's an obligation of democratic society. So I don't think one needs to sacrifice democracy to have security. I think that's a false dichotomy. I spent many years at the Wilson Center researching this. How do democracies respond to insecurity, specifically in Central America organized crime? I do think there are ways to do it. There are some examples of success. But the easy solution is to say we can't secure people without violating all these norms and standards and human rights. And I would be the first to admit that at times it's very popular. I can't deny that. I do think there's a trade-off that's being made. People give up democratic rights in exchange for security, which seems good at the moment, but in the long run it's a problem. Here's what's happened in Salvador. I'm sorry. The president, Bukele, came in with a strong democratic mandate. There's no question he won overwhelmingly. A year later, his party took control of Congress. There's no question that they did so successfully. But again, in many instances, many histories around authoritarianism, they come in as a democratic force. This is what happened with Hugo Chavez. Open elections led to his, and then once they're in power, and in the popularity that they enjoy in that moment, they begin to dismantle all of the other control mechanisms. Erosion of the independent press, or the press at all, erosion of the justice system. Bukele fired the attorney general, and within 24 hours put in place a new attorney general. So no pretense of any kind of examination or anything. His own person. That happened with the justice system. He has shut down all sort of transparency mechanisms, reporting on crime, violence, economic indicators, health indicators. Those things have all been brought under his direct control. So a lot of the information we have now is only coming from them. There's no outside monitoring. There's no outside oversight over that process. So I would acknowledge that there's probably less crime now. There's probably less violence on the streets. There's a lot of reason to say that. But the data isn't there to say, okay, this is a systemic change. Some good friends have spent a lot of time studying the gangs in El Salvador say most of the leadership is in Honduras and Guatemala and Mexico now, awaiting a change. We'll come back.
That's interesting.
I don't know. I just think we have to be careful about jumping to easy conclusions in El Salvador when the government has so effectively eroded what we would consider democratic institutions and democratic practices.
And it's interesting your point that perhaps the leadership has found safe haven elsewhere, and the folks that are being swept up are the street criminals in some way or others.
Well, right, and so just to give you one example here, Eric, there are a number of specialists, and I've been part of this. We've argued over how many gangs really are in El Salvador. It's one of those things, you know. The highest estimates were 20,000, 22,000. A lot of people said that's ridiculous. It's not that much. 10,000. Never mind. 20,000. They have now incarcerated over 60,000 people in their gang sweeps. So just simple math tells you they're not just imprisoning gang members. They're imprisoning the usual suspects. They go into neighborhoods, round up anybody with a tattoo, anybody who looks cross-eyed, anybody that is a friend of a gang member. I mean, this is not a process whereby we're being hard on crime. We're just being hard on the citizenry. And that ultimately will have a backlash, and increasingly it's having a backlash in El Salvador.
Well, I hope you'll come back at some point and talk to us about that, because I think you're right. It's too early to tell, but there are some indications. One country where we do have some real conclusions we can draw is Nicaragua. It's a brutal dictatorship. Is democracy possible again in Nicaragua?
Well, I'm an optimist at heart. Yes, I would say someday it is possible, and I think we all need to work towards that goal. There's no question. I think it's pretty hard to envision right now in the current system with the family control, the Ortega Murillo control. It's gone beyond any pretense of a democracy, of independent institutions. No one is willing to observe and give a rubber stamp to elections in Nicaragua. They've really gone beyond all. And they've fallen to levels of cruelty that even Venezuela and Cuba don't do. I mean, that's the stunning thing about it. They have not only imprisoned people for political reasons, they've taken away their citizenship. That means they don't exist anymore. So any property in their name is gone, any pensions they might have had. I mean, that's a level of cruelty that we don't even see in Venezuela or Cuba.
It's also interesting, the assault that they've made on the Catholic Church and on people of faith. It's extraordinary because during the first time that Daniel Ortega was dictator in Nicaragua, he largely left the Catholic Church alone, no?
Right. There was a real alliance with Cardinal, one of the cardinals at the time, and Father Miguel Escoto was part of his first government. I mean, there was a real synergy. A leftist church, no doubt, but there was sort of a synergy there. Now it seems like a pretty frontal assault. They've imprisoned a bishop. They've got many priests in prison and exiled. Look at it, and it's not just the Catholic Church.
Correct.
They've or the official Catholic Church. They've expelled the Sisters of Mother Teresa.
Yes.
They've expelled the Salvation Army. A lot of the evangelical churches are under assault. So it's across the board, and it's a very very difficult situation, and ability to think about restoring democracy under the current situation. I think there's just going to have to be some dramatic generational change, if I can use that euphemism, and some dramatic change within Nicaragua. I'm pessimistic insofar as there don't seem to be a lot of options, but the exile community has to come together and work from abroad. You
wonder what the end game is, though. I mean, just a complete assault on every institution, both official and non-official in the country, and where does it lead? I mean, total control. You already have total control. The cruelty that you're pointing to, I think, is very an important point.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I scratch my head. I don't know what the end game here is. It seems to me to be perpetuation. Handing power down to his children, presumably to his wife first, then to his children or some family member. I actually think, and maybe this is way off base, but I actually think that the Ortega Murillos care less about their country than they do themselves.
Well, I don't think that's in question at all. And in fact, you talk about generational change. I think they're also looking for generational change to their own family members.
Of course.
In the brief moments that we have remaining, we haven't talked about one additional country in the northern part of Central America. That's Honduras.
Yes.
Are you concerned about some of the trends you're seeing there, or is that a country that somehow is escaping the trend lines that we've been talking about?
Not at all.
Yeah.
And this is the country that probably I know the best. I lived there
Right.
For a couple of years, and I have deep relationships there. Yes, I will acknowledge that there was some sense of optimism at the beginning of this presidency, Xiomara Castro, more because it was a reaction to a corrupt former government. Juan Orlando Hernandez is now in jail in New York for drug trafficking. So there was such a rejection of that, and we were hopeful that this was a new opportunity. Sadly, and I still try to find some reason for hope, but sadly, those hopes have been, slowly eroding. There have been so many attacks against the independent press. I've been with someone this week who's a national figure in anti-corruption. She's been threatened, under threat by people around the government. It's just been a really discouraging process, and there are the corruption still permeates the country as a major issue.
Yeah, well, we haven't found too many points of light here in terms of our conversation. Is there anything positive we can point to across the region that the business community or others who are looking at this and saying, well, what's the positive takeaway here?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think a little bit about some of the other countries in the world, maybe a Poland or Romania or something that faced probably even worse situations, and how they were able to overcome those totalitarian governments. Part of it, was the geopolitical, et cetera, but part of it was actually civil society coming together and becoming a focal point for change in their countries. The United States can do a lot of things, but they can't force the kinds of changes we would like to see in Nicaragua or Guatemala or Honduras or Salvador. It will depend on civil society, a strong independent press, social movements, NGOs with expertise coming together across ideological lines. I mean, I think we've seen some interesting efforts in El Salvador with some in the private sector joining with other NGOs that historically would be considered leftist or center-left, coming together to say, wait a minute, democracy is really at stake here. We have to work together for our country. We've seen some of that in Guatemala, maybe not as much as we'd like. So I would say that the hope and the future for these countries is a good U.S. policy, but one that enables and makes space for and supports and allows exiles and opposition people to build and become the focal point for change in their countries. And let's be honest, that's not a thing that'll happen next year, right? That's a thing that's going to happen over time, it can happen.
Well, Tocayo, I want to thank you for joining us here at the Council of the Americas, the Democracy Dialogues. What a fascinating conversation, and I hope we have the chance to welcome you back at some point.
Well, it was my honor and privilege, and it's always great to share the stage with you, Eric. Congratulations on your work.
Thank you. And to all of you, too, here at the Democracy Dialogues, where each month we explore the most pressing issues of democracy in the Americas. Find us here on YouTube at the beginning of each month, or watch past episodes at as-coa.org/democracydialogues. Until then, let's continue to work together to ensure that democracy delivers for all of us.